She was 14 and already planning to kill her parents. She mixed the drinks. She served the meals. She watched them weaken every single night. Then she smirked when detectives arrived. She laughed when doctors desperately fought to keep them alive. But what she never expected was a witness. One child, one sentence, one truth she couldn't erase. This is the case that stunned investigators and revealed the unimaginable cruelty hiding behind a teenage smile. 14-year-old Ava Lambert didn't walk into the courtroom like a frightened child. She drifted in slowly, almost studying the room, as if she already knew how the day would end. Her parents were lying miles away in hospital rooms, barely able to speak. Yet Ava sat with a quiet, unsettling calm that made even the judge pause. Investigators said the plan behind her expression had been unfolding for weeks in whispered steps and hidden patterns. And the one person who could reveal the truth wasn't a detective or doctor, but her 9-year-old little brother. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This is how it all began. The Lambert family looked perfect from the outside. Daniel and Melissa worked long hours to keep their 2 children fed, clothed, and safe in a quiet Maryland suburb where nothing ever happened. Ava was their oldest, smart and distant, always buried in her laptop or staring at her phone. Eli was their youngest, the one who still laughed at cartoons and believed his big sister could do no wrong. But something had shifted in that house over the past year. Ava had grown colder, more resentful, watching her parents with eyes that held no warmth. She stopped talking at dinner. She stopped pretending to care. And then one night, Melissa took a sip of her evening tea and tasted something bitter underneath the honey. She thought nothing of it at first. That was her first mistake. The Lambert house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac where kids rode bikes until the street lights came on and neighbors waved from their porches. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and knew each other's names. Daniel Lambert worked in IT support, the kind of job that meant answering panicked calls at midnight and fixing problems no one else could solve. Melissa managed the front desk at a dental office, smiling through 8-hour shifts while her feet ached and her patience wore thin. They weren't rich, but they were stable. They paid their bills on time, packed lunches every morning, and made sure their kids had what they needed. From the outside, they looked like they were doing everything right. Ava had always been different. Even as a toddler, she didn't cry when she fell or reach for hugs when she was scared. She watched people instead of playing with them, studying faces like she was trying to figure out how they worked. Teachers called her gifted. She read above her grade level and aced every test without trying. But there was something missing in her eyes, something warm that other children had, and she didn't. Melissa used to tell herself it was just Ava's personality, that some kids were quieter and more serious. Daniel wondered if it was normal for a daughter to flinch when he tried to hug her. They told themselves she'd grow out of it. They told themselves she just needed space. Eli was the opposite. He was 9 years old and still believed the world was good. He laughed at everything, collected rocks from the backyard, and made up songs about his pet hamster. He adored his older sister even though she barely looked at him. When Ava walked past him without speaking, he'd follow her around asking questions she never answered. When she locked her bedroom door, he'd sit outside it hoping she'd come out and play. Melissa would watch him waiting and feel her heart crack a little. She didn't understand why Ava treated him like he was invisible. Daniel would ruffle Eli's hair and tell him to give his sister space. But Eli never stopped trying. He believed that one day she'd smile at him the way sisters were supposed to. By the time Ava turned 14, the coldness had turned into something sharper. She stopped pretending to care about family dinners. She'd sit at the table scrolling through her phone while her parents asked about her day, answering in one-word sentences that made it clear she didn't want to talk. When they asked her to help with chores, she'd stare at them like they'd insulted her. Melissa started to feel like a stranger in her own home, walking on eggshells around a daughter who looked at her with open contempt. Daniel tried to set boundaries, taking away her phone when she refused to follow rules. Ava didn't argue. She just stared at him with those empty eyes, until he looked away first. The resentment grew in ways they couldn't see. Ava spent hours alone in her room, door locked, headphones on, diving deeper into corners of the internet her parents never knew existed. She watched videos about unsolved cases and criminal psychology. She read forums where people debated the perfect crime. She convinced herself that her parents were controlling her, suffocating her, keeping her from becoming who she was supposed to be. In her mind, they were the problem. In her mind, everything would be better if they were just gone. She didn't see them as people anymore. She saw them as obstacles. And obstacles, she'd learned, could be removed if you were smart enough and patient enough to plan it right. The first sign came on a Tuesday night in late autumn. Melissa had just finished cleaning up after dinner when Ava appeared in the kitchen doorway holding 2 mugs of tea. She said she'd made them as an apology for being distant lately, that she wanted to do something nice. Melissa's heart lifted. She thought maybe her daughter was finally coming around, finally trying to connect. She took the mug and thanked her, ignoring the strange look in Ava's eyes as she watched her take the first sip. The tea tasted slightly bitter, but Melissa assumed it was just steeped too long. She drank half of it before pouring the rest down the sink. That night, she woke up with cramps so severe she couldn't stand. Daniel found her on the bathroom floor at 3 a.m, pale and shaking. He wanted to call an ambulance, but Melissa insisted it was just food poisoning. She'd be fine by morning. And she was, mostly. But something small and terrible had already begun. Ava watched her mother recover over the next few days and took notes. She wrote them in a journal she kept hidden under her mattress, tracking the dose, the timing, the symptoms. She wrote down how long it took for the cramps to start and how long they lasted. She noted that her mother blamed the takeout they'd ordered, not the tea. That meant she could try again. That meant she'd been careful enough. Eli noticed his sister smiling to herself that week, humming while she did her homework. He asked her why she seemed so happy. Ava looked at him like he'd said something stupid and told him to leave her alone. He did, because that's what he always did. He didn't know his sister was already planning the next step. He didn't know she'd just proven to herself that she could get away with it. 3 weeks after Melissa's incident, Daniel started feeling off. It began with exhaustion that didn't make sense, the kind that clung to him even after a full night's sleep. He'd wake up feeling like he'd been hit by a truck, his muscles aching and his head pounding. At first he blamed it on work stress. His company had just gone through layoffs, and he'd been picking up extra shifts to prove he was indispensable. Melissa told him to take it easy, to drink more water and get more rest. He tried, but the exhaustion only got worse. Then came the stomach cramps, sharp and twisting, hitting him in waves that made him double over. He'd spend 20 minutes in the bathroom before work, sweating and nauseous, wondering if he'd picked up a virus. Ava watched her father suffer with clinical detachment. She'd sit at the breakfast table while he clutched his stomach, observing the way his face went pale and his hands shook. She'd ask him questions that sounded concerned but weren't, taking mental notes about timing and severity. When Melissa suggested he see a doctor, Ava interrupted to say it was probably just stress, that doctors would waste his time and money. Daniel agreed because the symptoms came and went, and on his good days he felt almost normal. He didn't notice that his good days were the days Ava stayed late at school or slept over at a friend's house. He didn't notice that his worst days were the mornings after Ava made him coffee before work, insisting she wanted to be helpful. The poison she'd chosen was brilliant in its subtlety. She'd spent weeks researching online, moving between public library, computers, and her school Chromebook to avoid leaving an obvious trail. She'd learned about plant-based toxins that broke down quickly in the body, substances that mimicked common illnesses and left doctors chasing the wrong diagnosis. The one she settled on could be ordered online if you knew where to look, marketed as a pest control solution but deadly in concentrated form. It arrived in a small brown box that she intercepted from the mailbox before anyone else saw it. She hid it in a locked pencil case in her backpack, carrying it with her everywhere. At night, she'd measure out tiny amounts using a dropper she'd stolen from the chemistry lab, diluting it just enough to make someone sick without killing them outright. She wasn't ready for them to die yet. She wanted them weak first. She wanted them helpless. Eli started noticing things that didn't add up, though he was too young to understand what they meant. He saw his sister stirring drinks longer than necessary, standing at the counter with her back turned while she worked. He saw her washing dishes immediately after serving food, scrubbing them harder than she needed to. One morning, he walked into the kitchen and found her pouring something from a small bottle into their father's travel mug. When he asked what it was, she snapped at him to mind his own business and shoved the bottle into her pocket. Eli felt a twist of confusion in his chest. His sister had never made coffee for anyone before. She barely spoke to their parents unless she had to. Why was she suddenly being helpful? The first moment of true disrespect came on a Saturday afternoon. Daniel was lying on the couch, too weak to move, a bucket beside him in case he got sick again. Melissa had gone to the pharmacy to pick up anti-nausea medication the doctor had finally prescribed after weeks of Daniel insisting something was wrong. Ava walked past her father and rolled her eyes when he asked her to bring him some water. She didn't say no. She just looked at him like he was pathetic and kept walking. Eli saw it happen. He stood in the hallway holding his toy cars, watching his sister's face twist into something ugly and cold. He wanted to say something, to defend his dad, but the words stuck in his throat. Ava scared him lately in ways he couldn't explain, so he brought his father the water himself, his small hands shaking as he carried the glass. That night, Melissa made dinner while Daniel stayed upstairs resting. She'd decided to cook something simple and bland, hoping it would settle his stomach. She made chicken and rice, nothing fancy, nothing that should cause problems. Ava volunteered to set the table, another unusual gesture that should have felt like progress but instead felt off. Melissa was too tired to question it. She was too worried about her husband and too stretched thin from working full-time and playing nurse at home. She didn't see Ava slip back into the kitchen while she was helping Eli wash his hands. She didn't see her daughter open the refrigerator and add 3 drops of clear liquid to the water pitcher they'd use with dinner. They ate together as a family for the first time in weeks. Daniel forced himself to come downstairs because Melissa had asked him to try, had said that maybe eating with everyone would help him feel more normal. He managed half a plate before the cramps started again, worse this time, radiating through his abdomen like fire. He excused himself and stumbled toward the bathroom, his face gray. Melissa started to follow, but Ava told her to let him deal with it himself, that hovering would just make him feel worse. There was something cold in the way she said it, something almost satisfied. Melissa felt a chill run down her spine but pushed it away. She told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself her daughter was just trying to help. But later that night, after Daniel had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep and Eli was in bed, Melissa stood in the kitchen holding the water pitcher. She lifted it to her nose and smelled nothing unusual. She poured herself a glass and hesitated, staring at the clear liquid like it might hold answers. Then she dumped the entire pitcher down the sink and refilled it from the tap. She didn't know why. She just knew something in her gut told her to. Upstairs, Ava lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through calculations. Her father was getting weaker faster than she'd expected. Her mother was still mostly fine, which meant she needed to adjust the dosage. She pulled out her journal and made notes by the light of her phone, documenting everything like it was a science experiment. She felt nothing when she wrote about her father's pain. She felt nothing when she imagined what came next. What she felt was control, the kind she'd never had before, and it was intoxicating. She didn't hear Eli crying quietly in the next room, scared because his dad was sick and his sister was acting strange. She didn't care that her family was fracturing. She only cared that her plan was working. And soon, very soon, she'd increase the dose enough to finish what she'd started. November brought cold rain and darker mornings, and with it came a shift that even the neighbors started to notice. Melissa began experiencing the same symptoms as her husband, though hers came on faster and hit harder. She'd wake up dizzy and disoriented, her heart racing for no reason. At work, she'd have to excuse herself to sit in the break room with her head between her knees, waiting for the waves of nausea to pass. Her coworkers asked if she was pregnant. She laughed and said no, but privately she wondered if something was seriously wrong. When she came home and found Daniel in the same condition, barely able to get off the couch, a dark thought crossed her mind. What if it wasn't stress or a virus? What if something in their house was making them sick? They went to the doctor together on a Wednesday afternoon, both of them pale and exhausted. They described their symptoms in detail, the timing, the severity, how they seemed to get worse at home and better when they were away. The doctor ran standard blood tests and checked for common toxins like carbon monoxide. Everything came back normal. He suggested it might be anxiety or a stomach bug they kept passing back and forth. He prescribed medication for the nausea and told them to rest, to reduce stress, to eat bland foods. They left feeling dismissed, but hoping he was right. They wanted to believe it was something simple, something that would pass. They didn't want to consider that someone was doing this to them deliberately. They especially didn't want to consider that the someone might be living under their roof. Ava had never cooked before. She'd always claimed she didn't know how, that it wasn't her responsibility, that her parents should handle it themselves. So when she suddenly volunteered to make dinner one evening, Melissa felt a complicated mix of hope and suspicion. She wanted to believe her daughter was finally maturing, finally trying to contribute to the family. But something in Ava's eyes when she made the offer felt rehearsed, like she was reading lines from a script. Daniel was too sick to care. He just wanted to sleep. Melissa agreed because she was too exhausted to argue, too worn down to question a gesture that should have felt like kindness. She stayed in the living room while Ava worked in the kitchen, listening to the sounds of pots clanging and water running, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in her stomach. Dinner was spaghetti with jarred sauce, simple enough that even someone with no experience could manage it. Ava served it with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, placing plates in front of her parents like she was performing a role in a play. Eli looked thrilled that his sister was being nice, chattering about his day at school while Ava stared at her phone. Melissa took a bite and tasted something slightly off, a metallic bitterness underneath the tomato and garlic. She mentioned it casually, not wanting to seem ungrateful. Ava said the sauce was probably just old, that maybe she should have checked the expiration date. Daniel ate without commenting, too tired to notice anything beyond the fact that he had food in front of him. That night, they both ended up violently ill, worse than ever before. Melissa called 911 at 2 a.m. when Daniel couldn't stop being sick and started showing signs of dehydration. The police responded to the house for a welfare check after the ambulance left. It was standard procedure when someone was hospitalized for unexplained illness, just a precaution to make sure the home environment was safe. 2 officers knocked on the door at 7 a.m. while Ava was getting ready for school. She answered in her pajamas, annoyed at being interrupted, acting like their presence was an inconvenience rather than a concern. They asked if they could look around, check for gas leaks or mold or anything obvious. Ava shrugged and let them in, trailing behind them with her arms crossed. The officers found nothing alarming. The house was clean, orderly, no signs of structural problems or contamination. One officer asked Ava how she was feeling, if she'd experienced any symptoms. She said no, she was fine, and offered no emotion when they mentioned her parents were in the hospital. The officer made a note of her demeanor but didn't think much of it at the time. What the police didn't see was the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Chen, who'd been watching the Lambert house more closely over the past few weeks. She'd noticed the ambulance, the police cars, the strange pattern of illness that seemed to be consuming the family. She'd also noticed Ava doing something odd in the garage a few days earlier. Mrs. Chen had been taking out her recycling when she saw the girl through the open garage door, standing near the workbench with a juice bottle in her hands. She appeared to be pouring something into it from a smaller container, working quickly like she didn't want to be seen. When Ava looked up and made eye contact, Mrs. Chen waved. Ava didn't wave back. She just stared until Mrs. Chen felt uncomfortable and went inside. It was such a small moment, easily dismissed. But Mrs. Chen couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right in that house. Eli had been staying with his grandmother since his parents went to the hospital, but he'd asked to come home to get his favorite stuffed animal. His grandmother brought him by that afternoon, and he ran upstairs to his room while she talked to Ava about how the adults were doing. Ava said they'd be fine, that everyone was overreacting. Eli came back downstairs clutching his bear, quieter than usual. His grandmother asked if he was okay. He nodded, but didn't speak. In the car on the way back, he finally said something that made his grandmother's blood run cold. He said his sister had told their teacher that their mom was just being dramatic, that she wasn't really that sick. He said Ava had laughed when she said it. His grandmother didn't know what to make of it, but she filed it away in her mind as something that felt wrong. That night, Daniel was moved to the ICU. His organs were starting to show signs of stress, and the doctors still couldn't figure out why. They'd ruled out everything common and were starting to test for rare conditions, environmental toxins, unusual infections. Melissa was stable but weak, kept for observation in a regular room. The hospital called Ava to inform her and asked if she wanted to visit. She said she had homework to finish and couldn't make it tonight. The nurse on the other end of the line paused, surprised by the girl's casual tone. She asked again, explaining that Ava's father was in critical condition. Ava sighed like the nurse was bothering her and said she'd try to come tomorrow. She never did. And when the hospital tried to reach her the next day, she didn't answer her phone. She was too busy researching what went wrong, trying to figure out why they weren't dead yet, calculating how much more she'd need to finish the job. The hospital toxicologist had seen a lot in her 20-year career, but something about the Lambert case bothered her in a way she couldn't shake. Two adults from the same household presenting with nearly identical symptoms, both deteriorating rapidly despite treatment, both showing organ stress that didn't match any known illness or infection. She ordered an expanded toxicology panel, the kind they reserved for suspected poisoning cases, testing for substances that wouldn't show up in routine blood work. It would take days to get results, but her instincts told her this wasn't natural. When she called the police to recommend a deeper investigation into the family's home environment, she made sure to emphasize that the pattern felt deliberate. Someone needed to look harder at what was happening in that house. Detective Sarah Reeves caught the case on a Thursday morning. She was a 15-year veteran with a reputation for being thorough and a gut sense for when people were lying. She'd worked child cases before, the kind that left scars you carried forever, and she approached the Lambert home with both professionalism and caution. She brought her partner, Detective Marcus Cole, who specialized in forensics and had a background in chemistry. They knocked on the door at 10 in the morning, knowing Ava should be at school but finding her home anyway. She answered in sweatpants and a hoodie, saying she'd stayed home sick. She looked perfectly healthy. She invited them in with a politeness that felt practiced, offering them water and asking how she could help. Reeves watched her carefully, noting how her expression never changed, how her eyes stayed flat even when they mentioned her father's critical condition. They asked permission to look around more thoroughly than the welfare check officers had. Ava agreed easily, too easily, like she had nothing to hide. She led them through the house, answering questions in a rehearsed tone, her story smooth and consistent. She said her parents had been sick for weeks, that doctors couldn't figure it out, that she'd been trying to help by making meals and keeping the house clean. When Reeves asked about the meals specifically, what she'd cooked, and when, Ava's timeline shifted slightly. First, she said she'd made dinner 3 times that week. Then she corrected herself and said it was only twice. Then she said actually maybe her mom had made one of those and she'd just helped. The inconsistencies were small, but they were there. Reeves made notes while Cole examined the kitchen with careful attention. Cole found the pots and pans scrubbed cleaner than anything else in the house, almost obsessively clean, still damp like they'd been washed recently. He opened the trash can and found nothing, completely empty, despite a family living there. He checked under the sink and found industrial-strength cleaner, the kind that could strip surfaces down to nothing. When he asked Ava if she'd cleaned recently, she said she'd done dishes that morning. He asked why the trash was empty. She said she'd taken it out yesterday. Everything had an answer, but the answers felt prepared. Cole asked if they could take some items for testing, specifically the cookware and anything used for food preparation. Ava hesitated for the first time, just a flicker of concern crossing her face before she smoothed it away. She said sure, whatever they needed. While Cole processed the kitchen, Reeves asked Ava about her relationship with her parents. Ava said it was fine, normal, no different than any other family. Reeves asked if they fought. Ava said sometimes, about typical stuff like grades and curfew. Reeves asked if Ava resented them. Ava's jaw tightened slightly before she answered. She said no. Why would she? They were just her parents. But her body language told a different story. She sat with her arms crossed, her leg bouncing with barely contained irritation, like she was annoyed at having to perform this conversation. When Reeves asked about her little brother, Ava's expression softened into something that almost looked fond. She said Eli was fine, staying with their grandmother, probably better off away from all this stress. It was the first genuine emotion she'd shown, and it confused Reeves until she realized what she was seeing. Ava cared about her brother. She didn't care about her parents at all. The breakthrough came from something small and seemingly innocent. Reeves asked if anyone else had access to the house, if there were spare keys or visitors who came regularly. Ava said no, just family. Then she mentioned that Eli sometimes used their dad's computer for games when he was bored. Reeves asked where the computer was kept. Ava pointed to the home office upstairs, saying their dad used it for work and left it on most of the time. Cole's head snapped up at that. A computer left on meant a computer with history, with cached data, with digital fingerprints that might not have been properly erased. He asked if they could take it for examination. Ava's face went carefully blank. She said she didn't think they needed permission for that, did they? Reeves said actually yes, they did, unless Ava wanted to make this a formal investigation with warrants. Ava said fine, take it, she had nothing to hide. They left the Lambert house with 3 boxes of evidence: cookware, cleaning supplies, and the computer. Reeves sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine, processing what they'd just witnessed. She told Cole that something was deeply wrong with that girl, that the flatness in her eyes when she talked about her dying father wasn't normal grief or shock. Cole agreed. He'd seen the way Ava's hands had trembled when they mentioned taking the computer, the only crack in her otherwise perfect performance. They drove to the station in silence, both knowing they were at the start of something dark. They just didn't know yet how dark it would get. Back at the lab, Cole started processing the cookware while Reeves sent the computer to their digital forensics team. The pots had been cleaned aggressively, but chemical traces could survive even industrial scrubbing if you knew where to look. Cole swabbed the interior surfaces and the handles, bagging each sample carefully. He noticed a faint chemical odor, something that didn't belong in cookware, something acrid that made his eyes water slightly. He flagged it as priority and sent it for immediate analysis. Meanwhile, the digital forensics specialist, a woman named Kim Torres, booted up Daniel Lambert's computer and started pulling the browser history. What she found in the first hour made her pick up the phone and call Reeves directly. She said they needed to see this now, not later. She said this wasn't a sick family. This was attempted murder. And the person who'd been searching for ways to poison someone slowly, methodically, without getting caught, had been using that computer during school hours on weekdays. The same hours when Ava Lambert should have been sitting in her classroom learning algebra. Kim Torres had worked digital forensics for 8 years and thought she'd seen everything the internet could offer in terms of human darkness. But sitting in front of Daniel Lambert's computer, scrolling through search after search, she felt her stomach turn. The queries started innocent enough, the kind of thing a curious teenager might look up for a school project. What makes people sick? Common household poisons. Symptoms of food poisoning. But then they evolved, becoming more specific, more calculated, showing a clear progression of intent. How long does it take for poison to work? Poisons that look like natural illness. Can doctors detect plant toxins in blood tests? Each search was dated and time-stamped, creating a timeline that told a chilling story. Someone had been planning this for months, researching carefully, learning from each query before moving to the next level. The deleted search history told an even darker tale. Whoever had been using this computer had tried to cover their tracks, running a basic cleaner program that erased the browser cache and temporary files. But they hadn't known about system restore points, backup files, and the deep cache that forensic software could recover. Torres pulled everything back like she was excavating layers of digital archaeology, each level revealing more damning evidence. She found searches for how much poison to use without killing immediately. Slow poisoning symptoms timeline. Do minors go to jail for murder? That last one appeared 17 times over a 3-month period, showing an obsession with legal consequences, a belief that age might provide protection. The searcher had even looked up specific cases of juvenile offenders, studying sentencing patterns, trying to understand the system they thought they could beat. What made the evidence irrefutable was the cross-referencing. Torres pulled the sync data from the school district's Chromebook management system after Reeves obtained an emergency warrant. Every student in the district was issued a Chromebook that synced to their personal account, allowing them to work both at school and at home. Ava Lambert's account showed the same searches appearing on her school device, conducted during class hours when she should have been paying attention to lectures. Torres found queries made at 10:15 on a Tuesday morning during what the school schedule showed was Ava's math class. She found more made during lunch period, during study hall, during the time between classes when students were supposed to be walking to their next room. Ava had been so confident in her anonymity that she hadn't bothered to log out or use private browsing. She'd researched murder like she was researching a history project, casual and unworried. The recovered files went beyond searches. Torres found a deleted document titled Science Notes that had nothing to do with science class. It was a detailed record of dosages, timing, and observed effects. The entries were clinical, emotionless, describing Daniel and Melissa Lambert like they were laboratory subjects rather than human beings. Subject A shows increased weakness after 3 drops mixed in morning beverage. Symptoms peak at approximately 4 hours. Subject B, more resistant, requires higher concentration. The document included dates that corresponded exactly with the times Daniel and Melissa had reported feeling their worst. It included notes about cleaning methods, disposal techniques, and even observations about which family members were present during which meals. At the bottom of the document was a section titled Adjustments, with bullet points listing ways to increase effectiveness. The final entry, dated 3 days before Daniel ended up in ICU, simply read, "Double the amount. Time to finish this." Reeves stood behind Torres reading the screen, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. She'd worked cases involving kids before, but never one where the premeditation was this clear, this calculated. This wasn't a moment of anger or a terrible accident. This was systematic, methodical, showing a level of planning that some adults couldn't achieve. She asked Torres to print everything, to create a complete timeline with every search, every document, every piece of digital evidence. They'd need it for the prosecutor, for the court, for the moment when Ava Lambert's defense attorney tried to claim this was somehow a misunderstanding. Torres worked through the night, building a digital portrait of intent that left no room for doubt. By morning, she had 200 pages of evidence that told one undeniable truth. Ava Lambert had tried to murder her parents, and she'd been stupid enough to document the entire process. The school administrators were horrified when Reeves showed them what had been conducted on their network. The principal, a man named Robert Hayes, who'd worked in education for 30 years, sat in his office staring at the printed searches like he couldn't make sense of the words. He kept saying Ava was a good student, quiet, never caused problems, got straight A's. Reeves told him that intelligence and morality weren't the same thing, that smart kids could be dangerous precisely because they thought they were smarter than everyone else. Hayes asked what they needed from the school. Reeves said she wanted to talk to Ava's teachers, her counselor, anyone who'd interacted with her regularly. She wanted to know if anyone had noticed warning signs, behavioral changes, anything that might have predicted this. Hayes made the calls immediately, his hands shaking as he dialed. The picture that emerged from those interviews was disturbing in its contradictions. Ava's teachers described her as brilliant but detached, someone who aced every test but never participated in class discussions. Her English teacher mentioned that Ava had written a short story last semester about a girl who poisoned her family, calling it creative but unsettling. The teacher had given her an A and never thought about it again. Her guidance counselor said Ava had never asked for help, never showed signs of distress, seemed completely self-sufficient. But the school librarian remembered something odd. She'd noticed Ava spending hours on library computers during lunch, always quickly closing windows when someone walked past. The librarian had assumed she was on social media or watching videos. Now she realized Ava had been researching something she didn't want anyone to see, using public computers to hide her digital trail. It hadn't worked, but the attempt showed consciousness of guilt. The final piece of digital evidence came from Ava's cell phone records, obtained through another emergency warrant. Torres analyzed her text messages, looking for anything that might reveal motive or planning. Most of it was typical teenage stuff, complaints about homework and conversations about shows and music. But there was one exchange with a friend from school, dated 2 weeks before Daniel was hospitalized, that made Reeves's blood run cold. The friend had asked Ava what she was doing that weekend. Ava had responded, "Probably nothing, just waiting for things to get better." The friend asked what she meant. Ava wrote back, "You'll see, I'm almost free." The friend had sent back a confused emoji and changed the subject. Ava never explained what she meant by freedom or what she was waiting for. But the timing aligned perfectly with her escalation, with the moment she'd decided to increase the dosage and finish what she'd started. She'd been counting down to her parents' deaths like other kids counted, down to summer vacation, and she'd been arrogant enough to hint about it in writing. That arrogance, Reeves thought, was about to destroy her completely. Detective Reeves knew the next step would be delicate. Eli Lambert was 9 years old, traumatized by his parents' hospitalization, and living with his grandmother in a house that smelled like lavender and old books. Reeves had interviewed child witnesses before and understood that the approach mattered as much as the questions. She couldn't lead him or pressure him. She needed to let him talk naturally, to share what he'd seen without realizing how important it was. She arranged to meet him at his grandmother's house on a Saturday morning, bringing a child psychologist named Dr. Nina Patel, who specialized in trauma cases. They sat in the living room with juice boxes and coloring books, trying to make the environment feel safe. Eli was small for his age, with dark circles under his eyes that no child should have. They started with easy questions about school, about his hamster, about his favorite games. Eli answered quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, glancing at his grandmother every few seconds for reassurance. Reeves asked if he missed his parents. Eli nodded and said he wanted them to come home. Dr. Patel asked if he understood why they were in the hospital. Eli said they were sick, that the doctors were trying to help them get better. His answers were simple and honest, showing no awareness of what had really happened. Reeves shifted carefully, asking if anyone in the house had been sick besides his parents. Eli shook his head and said no, just them. Reeves asked if that seemed strange to him. Eli paused, his crayon stopping mid-stroke. He said he'd wondered about that too, why Ava never got sick like everyone else. The opening was there, and Reeves took it gently. She asked if Eli had noticed anything unusual before his parents got sick, anything different about how meals were prepared or who was making food. Eli's face scrunched up in concentration, trying to remember through the fog of worry and confusion. He said Ava had started making drinks for their dad, coffee in the mornings before school. Reeves asked if that was normal. Eli said no. Ava never helped with anything usually, so it was weird when she started being nice. Dr. Patel asked how it made him feel when his sister acted differently. Eli said it made him happy at first, because he thought maybe she'd finally want to play with him. But then he said something that made both adults lean forward slightly. He said Ava would get mad if anyone watched her while she was in the kitchen, that she'd tell him to leave her alone if he came in while she was making something. Reeves asked if Eli had ever seen what Ava was putting in the drinks. The boy's expression changed, his eyes going distant, like he was watching a memory play out in his mind. He said once he'd come downstairs early for breakfast and saw Ava standing at the counter with a small bottle, the kind that medicine comes in. She was holding it over their dad's coffee mug, tilting it carefully like she was counting drops. When Eli asked what she was doing, Ava had jumped and shoved the bottle in her pocket so fast she almost dropped it. She told him it was just flavoring, that Dad liked vanilla in his coffee. But Eli had smelled the coffee later and it didn't smell like vanilla. It smelled wrong, like chemicals or cleaning supplies. He hadn't said anything because Ava scared him when she got angry, and he didn't want her to yell at him. Dr. Patel's voice was soft when she asked the next question, so gentle it barely disturbed the air. She asked if Ava had ever said anything about the drinks, about why she was making them or what she wanted to happen. Eli went very still, his small hands gripping the crayon until his knuckles went white. His grandmother reached over and touched his shoulder, telling him it was okay, that he could say anything and no one would be mad. Eli's eyes filled with tears, and when he spoke, his voice cracked with the weight of a secret he'd been carrying without understanding its meaning. He said that one night, after their dad had gotten really sick and had to lie down, Ava had come into his room. She'd sat on his bed in the dark and told him not to worry, that the drinks she was making would help their parents sleep better, that soon they'd sleep for a long time and everything would be quieter and easier. The room went silent. Reeves felt her heart hammering in her chest, understanding immediately what those 8 words meant. The drinks make them sleep. Not help them. Not medicine. The drinks that Ava was making, deliberately and with purpose, were designed to hurt. Eli didn't understand the full meaning of what his sister had told him. He'd interpreted it as something good, something caring. He didn't know that sleep was a euphemism, that his sister had been telling him about murder without using the word. Dr. Patel asked Eli very carefully if he'd told anyone else about what Ava said. Eli shook his head and whispered that Ava had made him promise not to tell, that she'd said it was their secret, that if he told anyone the police might take her away, and then he'd be all alone. He'd kept the promise because he loved his sister. He'd kept it even though something inside him knew it was wrong. Reeves stepped outside to make a phone call, her hands shaking as she dialed the forensics lab. She told Cole they needed to find that bottle, the small one Eli had described, and they needed to search Ava's room immediately with a new warrant. She explained what Eli had said, the admission Ava had made to her own brother, the confession she'd given to a 9-year-old because she thought he was too young to understand or too loyal to tell. Cole said he'd have the warrant within the hour and would meet her at the Lambert house. Reeves went back inside and knelt in front of Eli, looking him in the eyes. She told him he was very brave, that he'd done the right thing by telling the truth, that none of this was his fault. Eli asked if his sister was in trouble. Reeves said yes, she was. Eli asked if he'd gotten her in trouble by talking. Reeves's heart broke as she said no, that Ava had gotten herself in trouble by making very bad choices. The forensic team descended on Ava's bedroom that afternoon while she was out with a friend, unaware that her world was about to collapse. They searched systematically, photographing everything, looking for the bottle Eli had described. They found it hidden in a locked pencil case inside her backpack, tucked under textbooks and notebooks like it was just another school supply. The bottle was small and brown, labeled as concentrated plant extract, sold legally online but deadly in the wrong hands. There was still liquid inside, maybe a third of the original amount remaining. Cole bagged it carefully, handling it like the weapon it was. They also found the journal Ava had kept under her mattress, the one with detailed notes about dosages and effects. They found the shipping receipt for the poison, crumpled in a shoebox at the back of her closet. They found everything because Ava had never believed she'd get caught. She'd thought she was too smart, too careful, too protected by her age to face real consequences. When Ava came home that evening, Reeves was waiting in the driveway. She read Ava her rights in the fading November light, her voice steady and professional. Ava's face went blank, that same empty expression she'd shown when they first interviewed her. She didn't ask what this was about. She didn't protest or cry or demand to call a lawyer. She just stood there staring at Reeves with those flat, dead eyes and said nothing. Reeves asked if she understood her rights. Ava nodded. Reeves asked if she wanted to say anything. Ava shook her head. As they put her in the back of the police car, Reeves saw the first crack in her mask. Ava's hands were trembling, her breath coming faster, the reality finally starting to sink in. The detective leaned down to the window and said quietly that Eli had told them everything. Ava's eyes widened for just a moment, shock and betrayal flashing across her face. Then it was gone, replaced by that cold blankness again. But Reeves had seen it. She'd seen the moment Ava Lambert realized that the little brother she thought was too young to matter had just destroyed her completely. The arrest made local news within hours, and by Monday morning the story had spread through Ava's school like wildfire. Students whispered in hallways, teachers spoke in hushed tones in the break room, and the principal issued a statement about cooperating with law enforcement. Reeves arrived at the school with a warrant for Ava's locker, knowing that teenagers often kept secrets in the one space they considered truly theirs. The locker was small and organized, textbooks arranged by size, a mirror on the inside door, a few photos of friends taped to the metal. To anyone else it would have looked completely normal. But Reeves had learned to look deeper, to check behind the normal for the hidden. She pulled out each book carefully, shaking them to see if anything fell out. In a biology textbook, tucked between chapters on cellular respiration and genetics, she found folded notebook pages covered in Ava's handwriting. The pages were different from the journal they'd already found. These were planning documents, rough drafts of the systematic approach Ava had ultimately used. The first page was titled Research Phase and contained a list of poisoning methods she'd considered and rejected. Arsenic was too detectable. Antifreeze was too obvious. Common household cleaners were too likely to be noticed. She'd written notes next to each option explaining why it wouldn't work, showing the same careful analysis someone might use when choosing a science fair project. The second page was titled Timeline and contained a calendar spanning 3 months. Certain dates were circled and labeled with cryptic abbreviations. Reeves compared them to the dates Daniel and Melissa had first reported feeling ill, and the correlation was perfect. Ava had planned each dose in advance, spacing them carefully to avoid suspicion, building up gradually to what she'd intended to be a fatal conclusion. The third page made even seasoned investigators pause. It was a detailed breakdown of dosage calculations, showing Ava's understanding of body weight, metabolism, and toxin concentration. She'd researched her parents' approximate weights and calculated how much poison would be needed to cause severe illness versus death. She'd drawn graphs showing the progression she expected, symptom timelines that matched medical literature with disturbing accuracy. At the bottom of the page was a section titled Safety Margin, where she'd noted that she needed to be careful not to give them so much that they died immediately and triggered an autopsy, but enough that their organs would fail gradually in a way that looked like natural illness. The level of premeditation was staggering. This wasn't an impulsive act or a moment of rage. This was murder planned with the precision of an engineering project. The fourth page contained something even more chilling: contingency plans. Ava had anticipated potential problems and written out solutions for each one. If they go to the hospital was followed by notes about staying calm, acting concerned, visiting enough to seem normal, but not so much that staff asked too many questions. If police investigate was followed by instructions to herself about cleaning thoroughly, disposing of evidence, maintaining her story. If they survive was followed by a single sentence that made Reeves's stomach turn. Increased dose during recovery period when they're home and vulnerable. Ava had thought of everything. She'd planned for every possible outcome except the one that actually happened. She'd never considered that her little brother might be brave enough to tell the truth, might love his parents more than he feared his sister's anger. Hidden in the spiral binding of a math notebook, Reeves found something that established the paper trail prosecutors would need. It was a printed return label from an online purchase, the kind sellers include in packages for easy returns. The label showed the company name, a supplier of agricultural and pest control products, and the order number. It had Ava's name on it as the recipient and the Lambert family address. She'd apparently printed it intending to return the unused portion of the poison, perhaps thinking she could get a refund once her parents were dead. The fact that she'd kept it showed either incredible arrogance or incredible stupidity. Either way, it was a direct link between Ava and the purchase of the toxin, physical proof that would be impossible for any defense attorney to explain away. Reeves bagged it carefully, adding it to the mountain of evidence that was building with every hour. The school's security footage provided another unexpected gift. Cole had requested it as part of the warrant, looking for anything that might show Ava's state of mind or activities. What he found was footage from the student parking lot, time-stamped on 3 separate occasions over the past month. Each clip showed Ava receiving packages from her car, small brown boxes that she quickly tucked into her backpack before heading into school. The camera had captured her looking around nervously each time, checking to see if anyone was watching. On one clip, a friend had approached and asked what she'd gotten. Ava had snapped at her to mind her own business, her face twisted with irritation. The friend had backed off, hands raised in apology. That reaction, that flash of anger when someone got too close to her secret, would play well in court. It showed consciousness of guilt, awareness that what she was doing was wrong. When confronted with the locker evidence during her second interrogation, Ava finally broke her silence. But what she said wasn't a confession or an apology. She sat across from Reeves in the interview room, her public defender beside her looking increasingly uncomfortable, and claimed the papers were fiction writing. She said she was working on a story for a creative writing competition, that all of it was made up, that she'd researched poisoning the same way authors research any topic. Reeves asked why she'd hidden the pages in textbooks instead of keeping them with her other schoolwork. Ava said she didn't want other students to see and steal her ideas. Reeves asked about the shipping label with her name on it. Ava hesitated, then said it must be from something else she'd ordered, maybe plant food for her mother's garden. The lies were transparent, desperate, falling apart even as she spoke them. The toxicology report came back that same afternoon, and it removed any remaining doubt. The liquid in the bottle from Ava's pencil case was a concentrated extract of water hemlock, one of the most poisonous plants in North America. Even small amounts could cause organ failure, seizures, respiratory distress, all the symptoms Daniel and Melissa had experienced. The concentration in Ava's bottle was high enough that a single teaspoon could kill an adult. The residue found in the Lamberts cookware matched the chemical signature perfectly. More damning still, the hospital finally got back results from Daniel and Melissa's expanded toxicology panels. Both showed traces of the same toxin in their systems, concentrated in their organs, slowly destroying them from the inside. The medical examiner who reviewed the case said that if they'd received even 2 or 3 more doses, they likely wouldn't have survived. Ava had been days away from succeeding when Eli's 8 words stopped her. Reeves compiled everything into a case file that ran over 300 pages. Digital evidence, physical evidence, witness statements, medical reports, and forensic analysis. She delivered it to the prosecutor's office with a recommendation that Ava Lambert be charged as an adult for 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree. The prosecutor, a woman named Jennifer Wallace, who'd spent 20 years putting away violent criminals, read through the file in one sitting. When she finished, she looked up at Reeves and said this was one of the most clear-cut cases of premeditated attempted murder she'd ever seen. The evidence was overwhelming. The intent was undeniable. The only question was whether a jury could accept that a 14-year-old was capable of this level of calculated evil. Wallace said she'd make them understand. She said Ava Lambert had planned murder like it was homework, and she was going to make sure the girl spent the rest of her childhood behind bars. Justice, she said, didn't have an age limit. The court ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation before trial, standard procedure in cases involving minors accused of serious crimes. Dr. Raymond Fisher, a forensic psychologist with 30 years of experience evaluating juvenile offenders, was assigned to assess Ava's mental state, cognitive functioning, and capacity to understand right from wrong. He'd evaluated hundreds of troubled teenagers over his career, kids who'd committed terrible acts out of abuse, neglect, mental illness, or momentary lapses in judgment. But sitting across from Ava Lambert in the sterile evaluation room, he realized within the first 10 minutes that she was different from anyone he'd assessed before. She wasn't damaged or confused or struggling with trauma. She was simply empty where empathy should have been, calculating where emotion should have lived. The evaluation took place over 5 sessions spanning 2 weeks. Dr. Fisher started with standard questions about Ava's childhood, her relationships, her understanding of what she'd been accused of doing. Ava answered everything with practiced politeness, her tone pleasant and her words carefully chosen. She described a normal childhood with loving parents who sometimes frustrated her with their rules. She said she had friends at school and did well academically. She talked about her brother with what sounded like fondness, calling him sweet and innocent. But Fisher noticed that her facial expressions never matched her words. When she talked about her parents almost dying, her face remained blank. When she discussed her brother's testimony against her, no anger or hurt crossed her features. She performed emotion when she thought she should, but she didn't actually feel it. Fisher administered a battery of psychological tests designed to measure personality traits, moral reasoning, and emotional capacity. The results painted a disturbing picture. Ava scored exceptionally high on measures of intelligence and cognitive functioning, confirming what her grades had already shown. But she scored in the clinical range for psychopathic traits: lack of empathy, shallow emotions, manipulation, grandiose sense of self-worth, and failure to accept responsibility. When presented with moral scenarios in the testing, she could identify the correct answers intellectually, explaining what someone should feel or do in a given situation. But when asked what she would feel, her answers revealed a fundamental disconnect. She understood that hurting people was considered wrong, but she didn't understand why it mattered beyond the consequences she might face. During one session, Fisher asked Ava directly about the poisoning. She'd been advised by her lawyer not to discuss specifics, but Fisher approached it hypothetically, asking her to imagine why someone might do what she'd been accused of. Ava leaned back in her chair, considering the question like it was an interesting intellectual puzzle. She said that if someone wanted to eliminate a problem, they'd need to be smart about it, patient, willing to do research and plan carefully. She said most people got caught because they were emotional or impulsive, acting out of anger instead of strategy. Fisher asked if she thought that approach was morally acceptable. Ava tilted her head and said morality was subjective, that what mattered was what you could get away with. Then she caught herself, seeming to realize she'd said too much, and added quickly that of course she didn't actually believe that. She was just theorizing. The most revealing moment came during a discussion about her parents' current condition. Daniel had been released from the ICU but remained hospitalized, his organs slowly recovering but permanently damaged. Melissa was home but weak, requiring assistance with basic tasks. Fisher asked Ava how it made her feel to know they were suffering. Ava paused, and for a moment something flickered across her face, something that might have been satisfaction before she buried it. She said it made her feel bad, that she wished they would get better soon. Fisher pressed gently, asking what bad meant to her, what that feeling was like in her body. Ava struggled to answer, her words vague and rehearsed. She said things like sad and worried, but couldn't describe any physical sensation of those emotions, couldn't point to a tightness in her chest or tears in her eyes. She was describing feelings she'd learned about but never experienced, reading from a script of normalcy she'd memorized without understanding. Fisher explored Ava's motive carefully, trying to understand what had driven her to such extreme action. She insisted she hadn't done anything wrong, that the evidence was circumstantial, that everyone was misunderstanding the situation. But when he asked hypothetically why someone in her position might want their parents gone, the mask slipped again. She talked about feeling controlled, suffocated by rules about homework and curfews and screen time. She described her parents as obstacles to her freedom, people who didn't understand her intelligence or appreciate her capabilities. She said they treated her like a child when she was clearly more mature than most adults. The resentment in her voice was real, the first genuine emotion Fisher had heard from her. But it was resentment without proportion, rage at minor parental boundaries that had somehow justified murder in her mind. What disturbed Fisher most was Ava's complete lack of remorse. Even teenagers who'd committed terrible crimes usually showed some recognition of harm, some guilt or shame about what they'd done. But Ava showed none. When he asked if she wished things had gone differently, she said yes, but only because she was now facing consequences. She didn't wish her parents hadn't suffered. She wished she hadn't been caught. During their final session, Fisher asked what she thought should happen to her now. Ava said she should go home, that she was just a kid who'd been accused of something she didn't do, that the system was treating her unfairly. Fisher asked if she understood that if the evidence was accurate, if she had done what prosecutors claimed, it would mean she'd tried to murder her parents. Ava met his eyes directly and said, "But I'm 14. They can't really put me in jail for real, can they?" That question revealed everything Fisher needed to know. Ava had researched juvenile justice extensively, knowing from her internet searches that minors often received lighter sentences than adults. She'd believed her age would protect her, that being 14 meant she could attempt murder and face minimal consequences. She'd planned the crime with the arrogance of someone who thought they were smarter than the system, someone who believed rules applied to other people but not to her. Fisher's final report to the court was unequivocal. Ava Lambert understood the nature and consequences of her actions. She knew right from wrong intellectually, even if she couldn't feel it emotionally. She was competent to stand trial, and most importantly, she showed clear signs of psychopathic traits that made her a continued danger if not properly contained and monitored. The defense team received Fisher's report and immediately hired their own psychologist, hoping for a more favorable evaluation. Dr. Linda Morrison spent 3 sessions with Ava and came to similar conclusions, though she framed them more sympathetically. She acknowledged Ava's lack of empathy, but suggested it might be treatable with intensive therapy. She noted Ava's youth and the possibility that her brain was still developing, that the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and moral reasoning wasn't fully mature. But even Morrison couldn't escape the evidence of premeditation, the months of planning that showed sophisticated reasoning and clear intent. Her report concluded that while Ava deserved treatment, she also required secure containment. The girl sitting in the juvenile detention center wasn't a child who'd made a terrible mistake. She was a calculating individual who'd tried to commit murder and failed only because her little brother had been braver than she'd anticipated. And that kind of cold-blooded planning, regardless of age, demanded justice. The pre-trial hearing took place on a gray January morning in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and recycled air. Ava Lambert entered wearing clothes her grandmother had brought, a modest sweater and khaki pants meant to make her look younger and more innocent. She'd been coached by her defense team on courtroom behavior, told to sit up straight, keep her hands folded, show appropriate emotion. But as the charges were read aloud, 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree with aggravating factors of premeditation and use of poison, Ava yawned. It wasn't subtle. She didn't bother covering her mouth. She just sat there looking bored while the prosecutor detailed how she'd systematically poisoned her parents over a period of weeks, bringing them to the edge of death. Several people in the gallery gasped. The judge, a woman named Margaret Thornton, who'd presided over criminal cases for 23 years, stopped the proceedings and stared at the defendant. Judge Thornton had seen every type of criminal in her courtroom, from remorseful first-time offenders to hardened repeat felons who showed no emotion. But something about a 14-year-old yawning during her attempted murder arraignment struck a nerve. She leaned forward and spoke directly to Ava, her voice sharp and commanding. She said that this court took these proceedings seriously, that the charges were grave, that Ava's parents had nearly died and deserved respect. Ava looked up at the judge with those flat, empty eyes and said nothing. No apology, no explanation, just silence. Her defense attorney, a young public defender named Marcus Chen, who'd been assigned the case, put his hand on her arm and whispered something urgent. Ava shrugged slightly and looked back down at the table. The message was clear. She didn't think any of this mattered. She still believed she'd walk away from this. The gallery was filled with people who had every reason to be there. Daniel and Melissa Lambert sat in the front row, Daniel in a wheelchair because he was still too weak to walk long distances, Melissa beside him holding his hand so tightly her knuckles were white. They'd been released from the hospital but would need months of recovery, possibly years before their organs fully healed if they ever did. When the bailiff asked everyone to rise for the judge's entrance, Daniel had struggled to stand, his wife supporting him, both of them moving like people decades older than they were. Ava had watched them shuffle in and turned away, refusing to make eye contact. Now they sat staring at their daughter's back, trying to reconcile the child they'd raised with the person who'd tried to murder them. Melissa's face was streaked with tears. Daniel's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. The prosecutor, Jennifer Wallace, stood to address the court about the state's intentions. She was in her 50s, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, known for her no-nonsense approach and her refusal to let violent criminals hide behind excuses. She stated clearly that the state would be seeking to try Ava Lambert as an adult, that the severity of the crimes and the level of premeditation demanded adult consequences. She outlined the evidence briefly: digital searches, dosage calculations, the toxin found in Ava's possession, the matching chemical signature in her parents' bodies, the testimony of her 9-year-old brother. She said this wasn't a child who'd made a mistake. This was a calculated predator who'd hunted her own parents in their own home. The defense objected to the characterization, arguing that inflammatory language was inappropriate at this stage. Judge Thornton sustained the objection, but noted that the state would have opportunity to present its full case at trial. Chen stood to argue against trying Ava as an adult, his voice earnest and his points rehearsed. He talked about her age, her lack of criminal history, her status as a child in the eyes of the law. He argued that the juvenile justice system existed specifically for cases like this, that children deserved rehabilitation rather than punishment, that sending a 14-year-old to adult prison was cruel and unusual. He painted Ava as a troubled youth who'd been influenced by violent content online, who'd lost touch with reality, who needed mental health treatment rather than incarceration. He asked the court to consider her potential for change, her young brain still developing, her whole life ahead of her. It was a compelling argument, delivered with genuine passion. But then the judge asked for a psychological evaluation to be entered into the record, and Chen's argument began to crumble under the weight of Fisher's findings. Judge Thornton read portions of the evaluation aloud, her voice steady, but her expression growing darker with each paragraph. She read about Ava's lack of empathy, her understanding of consequences, her sophisticated planning and execution. She read the section where Ava had essentially admitted that she believed age would protect her from real punishment, showing clear awareness that what she'd done was criminal. The judge looked up from the report and asked Chen directly if he was arguing that his client didn't understand right from wrong. Chen hesitated, trapped between two bad options. If he said yes, he'd be contradicting the psychological evaluation. If he said no, he'd be admitting she was competent to face adult charges. He tried to thread the needle, arguing that understanding and fully comprehending were different things. Judge Thornton cut him off and said the court would order its own competency evaluation, but based on the evidence presented, she was inclined to grant the state's motion. The ruling sent a ripple through the courtroom. Ava would be evaluated again, but the judge's inclination was clear. If that evaluation confirmed what Dr. Fisher had found, Ava Lambert would stand trial as an adult for attempting to murder her parents. The potential sentence shifted from juvenile detention until age 21 to decades in adult prison. Chen requested bail, arguing that his client wasn't a flight risk and had family willing to supervise her. Wallace stood immediately and argued that Ava was absolutely a danger to the community, specifically to the people she'd be released to. She reminded the court that Ava had tried to poison her own parents in their own home, that her brother had been in that house the entire time, that releasing her put everyone at risk. Judge Thornton agreed and denied bail without hesitation. Ava would remain in juvenile detention until trial. As the bailiff prepared to escort her out, Ava finally showed emotion. Not remorse or fear, but anger. Her face twisted with it as she looked back at her parents one last time. The moment outside the courtroom captured what the case had become. News cameras crowded the hallway, reporters shouting questions at Wallace and Chen as they exited. Daniel and Melissa were escorted out through a side door to avoid the media circus, but not before Daniel paused to speak briefly to the press. His voice was weak but determined as he said that justice needed to be served, that his daughter had made choices that nearly killed them, that they supported the prosecutor's decision fully. A reporter asked if they still loved her. Daniel's face crumpled, and Melissa pulled him away before he could answer. The question hung in the air, unanswered and maybe unanswerable. How do you love someone who tried to murder you? How do you reconcile parental instinct with the evidence of your child's cruelty? Those questions would haunt the Lambert family for the rest of their lives, but right now, they were just trying to survive long enough to see justice done. And in the juvenile detention center, Ava Lambert sat in her cell staring at the wall, still convinced that somehow, some way, she'd find a path out of this. She hadn't learned yet that intelligence without conscience only digs the hole deeper. The trial began on a cold Monday in February, nearly 4 months after Ava's arrest. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and community members who'd followed the case from the beginning. Jury selection had taken 3 days, with both sides fighting over every potential juror's ability to be impartial when facing a teenage defendant accused of such calculated violence. The final 12 sat in the jury box looking somber and uncomfortable, aware that the decision they'd make would follow them forever. Judge Thornton had granted the state's motion to try Ava as an adult after the second psychological evaluation confirmed everything Dr. Fisher had found. Now Ava sat at the defense table wearing a button-down shirt and looking younger than her 14 years, exactly as her lawyers intended. But her eyes still held that same emptiness, and the jury noticed. Wallace's opening statement was methodical and devastating. She walked the jury through a timeline that started with Ava's first internet searches and ended with Daniel Lambert in the ICU fighting for his life. She explained that this wasn't a case built on circumstantial evidence or questionable testimony. This was a case built on the defendant's own words, her own planning documents, her own digital footprint. Wallace promised that over the next week the jury would see evidence so clear and so damning that they'd have no choice but to convict. She said they'd hear from doctors, forensic experts, police investigators, and most importantly, from a 9-year-old boy who'd been brave enough to tell the truth about his sister. Chen's opening was shorter, focused on reasonable doubt and the possibility that Ava had been researching for school projects, that coincidences weren't crimes, that the state's case was built on assumptions. But even he seemed to know his argument was weak. The first wave of evidence came from Ava's digital life, and it buried her. Kim Torres took the stand and walked the jury through every search, every deleted document, every piece of data recovered from Daniel Lambert's computer and Ava's school Chromebook. The prosecution had created a visual presentation, projecting the searches onto a large screen so everyone could read them. How to poison someone slowly so they don't know. Do minors go to jail for murder? Poisons that look like natural illness. Each search appeared with its timestamp, showing the progression of research over months. Torres explained how the data was recovered, how syncing between devices proved Ava had conducted these searches both at home and at school, how the sheer volume and specificity eliminated any possibility of innocent explanation. The jury took notes, their faces growing darker with each new revelation. The most damaging piece of digital evidence was Ava's own documentation. The deleted file titled Science Notes appeared on the screen, and Wallace read portions aloud. Subject A shows increased weakness after 3 drops mixed in morning beverage. Symptoms peak at approximately 4 hours. The clinical language, the careful observations, the complete absence of humanity in describing her parents' suffering made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. One older woman in the back row shook her head slowly, her expression heartbroken. Wallace emphasized that these weren't the notes of someone confused or mentally ill. These were the notes of someone conducting a deliberate experiment with human subjects who happened to be her mother and father. Chen objected repeatedly, arguing that the language was inflammatory, but Judge Thornton overruled him each time. The evidence spoke for itself. The physical evidence came next, displayed in clear evidence bags for the jury to examine. The small brown bottle from Ava's pencil case, still containing traces of the poison. The shipping label with her name and address. The notebook pages found in her locker with dosage calculations and timeline planning. Each item was presented with testimony from the officer who'd discovered it and the forensic expert who'd analyzed it. The toxicologist who'd tested the bottle's contents explained in simple terms what water hemlock extract was, how it affected the human body, why even small amounts could be fatal. She showed the jury side-by-side comparisons of the chemical signature from the bottle and the toxins found in Daniel and Melissa's bodies. They matched perfectly. There was no ambiguity, no room for alternative explanations. The poison in Ava's possession was the same poison that had nearly killed her parents. Wallace then presented evidence that destroyed any remaining doubt about intent. Text messages from Ava's phone appeared on the screen, including the conversation where she'd told a friend, "I'm almost free." Phone records showed she'd been researching poisons the same day she sent that message. Credit card receipts proved she'd used prepaid cards to purchase the toxin, showing consciousness of guilt and an attempt to hide the transaction. Surveillance footage from the school parking lot played on a loop, showing Ava nervously receiving packages and hiding them in her backpack. Every piece of evidence built on the last, creating a picture so complete that even Ava's defense team seemed to be going through the motions rather than genuinely fighting. The forensic timeline was perhaps the most powerful element of the prosecution's case. Wallace had worked with medical experts to create an animated reconstruction showing when each poisoning likely occurred based on Daniel and Melissa's symptom reports, hospital admissions, and the dates in Ava's planning documents. The animation showed the Lambert house with a calendar overlay, highlighting the days Ava had noted in her timeline. Red dots appeared over meals she'd prepared, growing darker as the doses increased. The jury watched as the animation showed both parents growing sicker in parallel with Ava's escalating plan. It was visual, undeniable proof of cause and effect. When the animation reached the night Daniel was rushed to the ICU, the date on screen matched the entry in Ava's journal that read, "Double the amount, time to finish this." Throughout all of this, Ava sat at the defense table showing no emotion. She didn't cry or shake her head or show any sign of distress. She occasionally whispered to Chen, but mostly she stared at the table or looked around the courtroom with apparent boredom. The jury noticed. Several of them kept glancing at her, clearly disturbed by her complete lack of reaction to evidence of her own cruelty. During a break, one reporter in the gallery whispered to another that Ava looked less like a defendant and more like a student sitting through a boring lecture. That observation would make it into several news articles, capturing the unsettling reality of a teenage killer who seemed incapable of understanding why everyone was so upset. The day's final piece of evidence was the most visceral. Wallace played the audio recording of the 911 call Melissa had made the night Daniel collapsed, her voice panicked and breaking as she begged for an ambulance. The courtroom fell completely silent, listening to her describe her husband's symptoms, the way he couldn't breathe properly, how his skin had gone gray. In the background, you could hear Daniel being sick, the sound of someone fighting for their life. Melissa's voice cracked as she asked the operator if he was going to die. The recording ended with sirens arriving. When the audio stopped, the silence in the courtroom felt heavy and complete. Several jurors had tears in their eyes. Melissa was crying openly in the gallery, Daniel's arm around her shoulders, and Ava sat at the defense table examining her fingernails, completely unmoved. Then something happened that no one expected. As Wallace paused to let the moment sink in, as the weight of that 911 call settled over everyone present, Ava smiled. It was small and quick, gone almost before it appeared. But the jurors in the front row saw it. The court reporter saw it, and most importantly, Wallace saw it. She made a note on her legal pad, underlining it twice. That smile would come up again in closing arguments, proof that Ava Lambert wasn't just guilty. She was proud of what she'd done. The second week of trial began with victim testimony, and the air in the courtroom felt different from the moment the doors opened. This would be the day when the Lambert family's pain became more than just evidence and timelines. This would be the day when the jury heard directly from the people whose daughter had tried to erase them. Melissa Lambert was still too weak to testify in person, her doctors warning that the stress might trigger a medical crisis. Instead, she appeared via video link from a hospital conference room, sitting in a wheelchair with an IV stand beside her. The camera showed her face in detail, the weight she'd lost, the hollowness in her cheeks, the tremor in her hands that came from nerve damage the poison had caused. When the video feed connected and her image filled the screen, the courtroom went completely silent. Wallace began gently, asking Melissa to state her name and relationship to the defendant. Melissa's voice was weak but steady as she identified herself as Ava's mother. Wallace asked her to describe her relationship with her daughter before the poisoning began. Melissa's composure started to crack immediately. She talked about loving Ava from the moment she was born, about trying everything to connect with a child who seemed unreachable. She described the distance that had grown between them, how Ava had become cold and withdrawn, how every attempt at affection was rejected. She said she'd blamed herself, wondered what she'd done wrong as a mother, spent sleepless nights trying to figure out how to reach her daughter. Her voice broke as she said she'd never imagined that Ava wasn't pulling away because of typical teenage angst. She was pulling away because she was planning murder. Wallace asked Melissa to describe the onset of her illness. Melissa closed her eyes, reliving memories that clearly still haunted her. She talked about the strange taste in her tea that first night, how she'd dismissed it as nothing. She described the cramps that felt like her insides were being torn apart, the exhaustion that made simple tasks feel impossible. She said she'd thought she was dying, but couldn't understand why. She'd gone to doctors who found nothing, taken medications that didn't help, watched her husband deteriorate alongside her, and felt helpless. The worst part, she said, was the guilt. She'd thought maybe she was making them sick somehow, that she'd contaminated something in the house or made a mistake with food preparation. She'd blamed herself for her family's suffering, never knowing that her own daughter was the source. The moment that broke the courtroom came when Wallace asked about the day Melissa learned the truth. Melissa's face crumpled, and for several seconds she couldn't speak through the sobs that overtook her. When she finally composed herself enough to continue, her words came out raw and devastated. She said that learning Ava had done this deliberately was worse than the poisoning itself. She said she could have forgiven an accident, could have understood a moment of rage, could have worked through almost anything. But knowing that Ava had researched and planned and watched them suffer day after day without feeling anything, that was a betrayal so profound it had shattered something inside her that would never heal. She looked directly into the camera, her eyes red and swollen, and said she didn't recognize her daughter anymore. The person who'd done this wasn't the baby she'd held or the child she'd raised. That person was a stranger wearing her daughter's face. Chen's cross-examination was brief and uncomfortable. He asked Melissa if she'd ever seen Ava actually put poison in food or drinks. Melissa said no, she hadn't. He asked if it was possible that someone else could have had access to their home. Melissa said they hadn't given anyone else keys. He asked if she still loved her daughter despite everything. Melissa went very still, her face showing the agony of that impossible question. She said she loved the child Ava could have been, the daughter she'd hoped to raise. But the person who'd tried to murder her and her husband, who'd watched them suffer without remorse, who'd showed no empathy or humanity, that person was beyond her ability to love. Chen had no follow-up questions. What could he possibly say to that? The next witness was Eli Lambert, and his appearance caused an immediate stir in the courtroom. He was small for 9, his feet barely touching the floor when he sat in the witness box. He wore a button-up shirt that was slightly too big, probably borrowed or bought specially for court. His face was pale and his eyes were wide with nervousness, darting around the room like he was looking for danger. A child psychologist sat nearby, present in case he became too distressed to continue. Judge Thornton spoke to him directly before testimony began, asking if he understood that he needed to tell the truth. Eli nodded and said yes in a voice barely above a whisper. She asked if he understood that his sister was the defendant. Eli's eyes found Ava at the defense table, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Eli's expression was hopeful, like he still expected her to smile at him or wave. Ava stared back with complete indifference, then turned away. The rejection was visible, a physical blow that made Eli's shoulders slump. Wallace approached him carefully, keeping her voice soft, and her questions simple. She asked if he knew why he was there. Eli said to talk about his sister. Wallace asked if he remembered his parents getting sick. Eli nodded and said it had been scary, that his dad couldn't get out of bed and his mom was crying all the time. Wallace asked if he remembered anything unusual before they got sick. Eli's small voice described seeing Ava making drinks and stirring them for a long time, how she'd gotten mad when he came into the kitchen. He talked about the small bottle he'd seen, the one she'd hidden when he asked about it. Wallace asked what Ava had told him about the drinks. Eli's eyes filled with tears as he repeated the words that had changed everything. She said the drinks make them sleep, that they'd sleep for a long time and everything would be quieter. The courtroom was so silent that the hum of the ventilation system seemed loud. Several jurors leaned forward, making sure they heard every word. Wallace asked Eli if he'd understood what his sister meant at the time. Eli shook his head and said he'd thought she was trying to help, that sleep was good for sick people. He said he'd believed his sister was being nice for once, that maybe she'd finally started caring about the family. His voice cracked as he said he'd been wrong. Wallace asked if it was hard for him to tell people what Ava had said. Eli nodded, tears streaming down his face now. He said he'd been scared of getting his sister in trouble, that he'd loved her even when she was mean to him. He said he'd kept the secret as long as he could, but then the police lady had been so nice and his parents were so sick, and he couldn't keep lying anymore. Chen approached Eli with visible reluctance, clearly uncomfortable with cross-examining a traumatized 9-year-old. He asked if Eli might have misunderstood what Ava meant about the drinks. Eli said he didn't think so. Chen asked if Ava had ever been mean to him or their parents before. Eli said yes, she was always kind of mean. Chen tried to suggest this proved Ava had behavioral issues, but wasn't necessarily a murderer. Wallace objected before he could finish the question, and Judge Thornton sustained it. Chen asked if Eli wanted his sister to come home. Eli looked at Ava again, that same hopeful expression crossing his face. He said he wanted his sister back, the one he remembered from when he was little, before she got so angry and scary. But he didn't know if that person existed anymore. He said maybe the police lady was right, that Ava needed to stay somewhere she couldn't hurt people. The answer clearly wasn't what Chen had hoped for. As Eli was dismissed, something happened that no one could have scripted. He climbed down from the witness box and started walking toward the gallery where his parents waited. But he paused at the defense table, standing just a few feet from his sister. He raised his hand in a small wave, a gesture so innocent and hopeful it broke hearts across the room. Ava could have waved back. She could have smiled or nodded or shown any acknowledgement of the brother who'd loved her despite everything. Instead, she deliberately turned her back to him, rotating in her chair to face away completely. The rejection was cruel and public, a final proof of her complete lack of empathy. Eli's hand dropped slowly, his face crumbling. His father wheeled himself to the railing and reached for his son, pulling him into a hug. The image was captured by every courtroom sketch artist present. A small boy crying into his father's shoulder while his sister sat with her back turned, unmoved and uncaring. It was a moment of betrayal in real time, and it told the jury everything they needed to know about who Ava Lambert really was. The defense's case began on a Wednesday afternoon, and from the opening moments, it was clear that Chen faced an impossible task. His strategy centered on portraying Ava as a troubled child who'd been influenced by violent content online, whose brain wasn't fully developed, who'd lost touch with reality through constant exposure to true crime stories and poisoning cases. He called Dr. Linda Morrison first, the psychologist the defense had hired for a second opinion. Morrison took the stand and acknowledged Ava's lack of empathy, but framed it as a developmental issue rather than inherent evil. She talked about adolescent brain development, how the prefrontal cortex wasn't fully mature until the mid-20s, how impulse control and moral reasoning were still forming. She suggested that Ava might not have fully understood the consequences of her actions, despite appearing intelligent and calculating. Wallace's cross-examination dismantled that argument systematically. She asked Morrison if someone needed a fully developed prefrontal cortex to understand that poison kills people. Morrison admitted they did not. Wallace asked if Ava's extensive research into poisons, dosages, and symptoms showed an understanding of cause and effect. Morrison said yes, it showed sophisticated reasoning. Wallace asked if someone who couldn't understand consequences would spend months planning and documenting their actions to avoid detection. Morrison hesitated, trapped by the logic. She tried to argue that understanding intellectually and comprehending emotionally were different, but Wallace cut through it by pointing to Ava's own words. The girl had researched whether minors go to jail for murder 17 times. That showed clear awareness of legal consequences. Morrison had no effective response. Chen called a media psychology expert who testified about the effects of violent content on young minds, arguing that constant exposure to true crime shows and murder documentaries could desensitize children and blur their understanding of reality. The expert described how teenagers who consumed this content obsessively sometimes began to see violence as entertainment rather than tragedy, how they might start to view real-world actions through a fictional lens. It was a creative argument, but Wallace destroyed it by pointing out that millions of teenagers watched true crime content without attempting murder. She asked if the expert was suggesting that watching documentaries removed moral responsibility. The expert said no, but that it could be a contributing factor. Wallace asked if contributing factors erased intent. The expert admitted they did not. Another defense argument collapsed under scrutiny. The defense tried to introduce evidence of Ava's online activity, showing the forums she'd visited and the content she'd consumed. Chen argued that she'd been exposed to dangerous ideas at a vulnerable age, that she'd essentially been radicalized by true crime communities that romanticized killers and celebrated perfect crimes. He showed the jury screenshots of posts from forums where users debated methods and shared strategies, trying to paint a picture of a child groomed by internet culture into believing murder was acceptable. But the prosecution countered by showing that Ava had never posted in those forums, had never engaged with that community. She'd lurked and learned, taking information without contributing, using the internet as a research tool rather than a social space. She wasn't being influenced by others. She was learning from them. The distinction mattered. Throughout the defense's case, the jury observed Ava's body language with increasing attention. She sat at the table with perfect posture but complete detachment, like she was watching a movie about someone else's life. When Morrison testified about brain development and diminished capacity, Ava rolled her eyes slightly, apparently annoyed at being portrayed as mentally impaired. When the media expert discussed vulnerable young minds, Ava tapped her fingers on the table in a rhythm that suggested boredom. Several jurors noticed these reactions and took notes. The defense was trying to paint her as a confused child, but her demeanor suggested she found the characterization insulting. She didn't look confused or vulnerable. She looked irritated that people didn't recognize her intelligence. The cracks in the defense widened when Chen called a teacher from Ava's school to testify about her academic excellence and lack of behavioral problems. The teacher, Ms. Patricia Coleman, described Ava as one of the brightest students she'd ever taught, someone who grasped complex concepts immediately and consistently scored at the top of the class. Chen intended this to show that Ava was a model student from a normal background, not someone who'd shown warning signs. But on cross-examination, Wallace asked Coleman about the short story Ava had written, the one about a girl poisoning her family. Coleman admitted she'd found it disturbing at the time, but had dismissed it as creative fiction. Wallace asked her to read a passage aloud. Coleman's voice shook as she read Ava's detailed description of watching parents suffer, written in first person with chilling emotional detachment. Wallace asked if Coleman now thought it had been fiction. Coleman said quietly that no, she didn't think it had been fiction at all. It had been a blueprint. The defense's final witness was Ava's grandmother, a frail woman in her 70s who'd been caring for Eli since the arrest. She testified about Ava's childhood, describing a quiet girl who'd always been a bit different but never violent or cruel. She talked about family holidays and birthdays, moments when Ava had seemed almost normal. She insisted that her granddaughter wasn't a monster, that something must have happened to change her, that the girl she'd known couldn't have done these things without some external influence. It was heartfelt and genuine, the testimony of a grandmother desperate to see good in a child she loved. But Wallace's cross-examination was gentle, yet devastating. She asked if the grandmother had spent significant time with Ava recently. The woman admitted she hadn't, that Ava had stopped visiting. Wallace asked if she'd seen the evidence presented at trial. The grandmother said yes. Wallace asked if that evidence changed her perspective at all. The grandmother started to cry, saying she didn't know what to believe anymore. Chen rested his case without calling Ava to testify, a decision that had clearly caused conflict between attorney and client. Ava had wanted to take the stand, confident she could convince the jury of her innocence despite all evidence to the contrary, but Chen knew that putting her up there would be suicide. Her lack of empathy, her inability to perform genuine emotion, her arrogance would shine through every answer. The jury would see exactly what the psychologists had documented, and any remaining doubt would evaporate. Ava was furious at the decision, her face tight with anger as Chen announced they would rest. She whispered something harsh to him, and he shook his head firmly. It was the first time anyone had seen her genuinely upset during the trial, not about the charges or her parents' suffering, but about not getting to speak. Her narcissism demanded an audience, and being denied that platform enraged her more than the possibility of conviction. The jury watched all of this with careful attention. They'd seen the evidence, heard the testimony, observed Ava's complete lack of remorse. They'd watched her turn away from her crying brother and smile during a 911 recording. They'd seen months of planning documented in her own handwriting. They'd heard her parents describe a betrayal so profound it had broken them. And now they'd watched the defense try desperately to explain away actions that had no innocent explanation. During a brief recess before closing arguments, several jurors were seen talking quietly in the hallway. A court observer later reported that one juror had said to another, "I've been trying to see the child, but all I see is the crime." That sentiment seemed to capture what everyone in that courtroom had witnessed. Ava Lambert might be 14 years old, but the person sitting at that defense table wasn't a confused child who'd made a mistake. She was someone who'd tried to commit murder, who'd watched her parents suffer without feeling anything, and who still seemed to believe she'd done nothing wrong. The gap between her age and her actions created a cognitive dissonance that disturbed everyone present. But the evidence didn't lie, and neither did her complete absence of humanity. The jury would soon have to decide which mattered more, the date on her birth certificate or the choices she'd made with calculated cruelty. The closing arguments took an entire day, both sides knowing this was their final chance to shape the narrative before the jury disappeared to deliberate. Wallace went first, standing before the 12 citizens who would decide Ava Lambert's fate and speaking with the controlled intensity of someone who'd spent weeks building toward this moment. She reminded them that this case wasn't about speculation or circumstantial evidence. This was about a mountain of proof so overwhelming that doubt wasn't reasonable, it was willful blindness. She walked them through the timeline again, from Ava's first internet searches to the moment Daniel Lambert collapsed in his home, showing how every piece of evidence connected in an unbroken chain of intent and action. She displayed the dosage calculations, the deleted documents, the poison found in Ava's possession, the matching toxins in her parents' bodies. She asked them a simple question: what innocent explanation could possibly account for all of this? Wallace reminded the jury of Melissa's testimony, the raw pain in a mother's voice as she described being betrayed by her own daughter. She reminded them of Daniel in his wheelchair, his organs permanently damaged, his life forever altered by someone he'd loved and protected. She reminded them of Eli's 8 words, spoken by a 9-year-old who'd trusted his sister completely and had that trust weaponized against him. She told them that Ava Lambert had turned her family home into a hunting ground, had poisoned her parents like they were nothing more than obstacles to eliminate. And when she was caught, when the evidence buried her, she'd shown no remorse. She'd smiled during a 911 call. She'd turned her back on her crying brother. She'd sat through weeks of testimony looking bored, like the suffering of others was merely tedious. The prosecutor addressed the defense's arguments directly, acknowledging that yes, Ava was 14, that yes, her brain was still developing. But she asked the jury to consider what that developing brain had created: months of research, detailed planning, systematic execution, careful disposal of evidence, and consciousness of legal consequences. This wasn't diminished capacity. This was sophisticated criminal thinking that most adults couldn't achieve. Wallace said the defense wanted them to believe that watching true crime shows made Ava do this, that she was a victim of internet culture or incomplete brain development. But the evidence showed someone who understood exactly what she was doing, who researched the legal system to see if she could get away with it, who believed her age would be a shield. Wallace's voice rose as she told the jury that age didn't erase intent, that evil could wear a school uniform, that justice didn't stop caring just because someone was young. Chen's closing was more subdued, the energy of a man who knew he was fighting an uphill battle. He asked the jury to remember that they were judging a child, that childhood meant incomplete development and poor decision-making. He painted Ava as someone who'd been lost in a world of violent content, who'd become desensitized to suffering through constant exposure to death and crime. He argued that she'd confused fiction with reality, that her research was the obsession of a troubled mind rather than the planning of a criminal one. He insisted that the juvenile justice system existed precisely for cases like this, that children deserved rehabilitation and education rather than adult punishment. He asked them to imagine sending a 14-year-old to prison for decades, to consider whether that served justice or merely satisfied revenge. His words were passionate, but they felt hollow against the weight of evidence. The jury received their instructions from Judge Thornton, who explained the charges clearly and carefully. 2 counts of attempted murder in the first degree required them to find that Ava had acted with premeditation and deliberation, that she'd intended to kill her parents and had taken substantial steps toward that goal. The judge explained that age was not a defense to the charges themselves, though it would be considered during sentencing if they found her guilty. She told them to consider only the evidence presented, to set aside sympathy and emotion, to focus on facts and the law. She reminded them that the defendant was presumed innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and that doubt must be reasonable, not imagined. Then she sent them to deliberate, and the waiting began. The jury was gone for less than 4 hours. In a case this complex, with this much evidence, court observers had expected days of deliberation. But when the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict late that same afternoon, it sent a clear message. They hadn't struggled. They hadn't been divided. They'd looked at the evidence and found the path to their decision straightforward. The courtroom filled quickly as word spread that a verdict was imminent. Daniel and Melissa returned, both looking exhausted and terrified. Eli stayed with his grandmother in a private room, too young to be present for this moment. News cameras lined the hallway. The energy in the room felt electric and heavy at once, everyone aware that the next few minutes would determine the rest of Ava Lambert's life. Ava entered looking different than she had throughout the trial. Her confidence seemed to have crystallized into arrogance. She stood with her chin raised, her posture perfect, like she was waiting to receive an award rather than a verdict. Chen looked nervous, shuffling papers he didn't need to shuffle, avoiding eye contact with his client. Wallace sat calmly at the prosecution table, her face unreadable. Judge Thornton took her seat and asked if the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson, a middle-aged man who'd sat in the front row throughout the trial, stood and said they had. The judge asked the defendant to rise. Ava stood slowly, Chen beside her, both facing the jury. The courtroom held its collective breath. The foreperson read from the verdict form in a steady voice. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree against Daniel Lambert, they found the defendant guilty. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree against Melissa Lambert, they found the defendant guilty. The words landed like physical blows. Behind the prosecution table, Melissa collapsed into sobs, Daniel holding her as tears streamed down his own face. Around the courtroom, people exhaled or gasped or whispered. And at the defense table, something extraordinary happened. The smirk that had haunted Ava's face since her arrest finally disappeared. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opening slightly in what looked like genuine shock. She turned to Chen and said something that the court reporter later confirmed was, "But I'm just a kid." Chen put his hand on her arm, but she shook him off. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, Ava Lambert looked confused, like the world wasn't following the script she'd written. Judge Thornton polled the jury individually, asking each one to confirm their verdict. 12 times, 12 people said guilty. 12 times, Ava's face grew paler, her composure cracking further. When the polling finished, the judge thanked the jury for their service and set sentencing for the following morning. She remanded Ava back to juvenile detention until that hearing. As the bailiff approached to escort her out, Ava finally showed real emotion. Not remorse or regret, but indignation. She looked at the jury like they'd betrayed her, like they'd failed to recognize her intelligence and superiority. She looked at her parents with something that might have been anger or confusion. And as she was led toward the door that would take her back to her cell, she said something under her breath that a reporter near the defense table managed to catch. She said, "It should have worked." Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." Just a simple statement of frustration that her plan had failed. Those 4 words confirmed everything the prosecution had argued. Ava Lambert wasn't sorry she'd tried to murder her parents. She was sorry she'd gotten caught. And that distinction would echo in everyone's minds as they waited for the sentencing that would determine how justice would finally be served. The courtroom filled early the next morning, everyone wanting to witness the conclusion of a case that had gripped the community for months. The gallery was packed with journalists, legal observers, and people who'd followed every moment of the trial. Daniel and Melissa Lambert sat in their usual spot in the front row, holding hands so tightly their fingers had gone white. They'd spent the night awake, processing the guilty verdict and preparing themselves for whatever came next. Behind them sat Ava's grandmother, looking decades older than she had at the start of the trial, her face etched with grief for everyone involved. Eli had been left at home again, still too young to witness his sister's final judgment, but his presence was felt in every mention of his bravery and the innocence Ava had tried to destroy. Judge Thornton entered precisely at 9 o'clock, her expression grave and her bearing heavy with the responsibility she carried. This wasn't just about punishing a crime. This was about deciding what happened to a 14-year-old whose actions demanded serious consequences, but whose age complicated every decision. The judge had clearly spent the night reviewing case law, sentencing guidelines, and the psychological evaluations that painted such a disturbing picture of the defendant. She asked if either side had anything to add before sentencing. Wallace stood and said the state trusted the court's judgment but emphasized that the victims deserved to see meaningful justice. Chen stood and made one final plea for leniency, arguing that juvenile facilities existed for exactly this purpose, that children could change, that decades in prison would destroy any hope of rehabilitation. Before the judge could respond, she asked if the victims wished to make impact statements. Daniel struggled to his feet, still unsteady, still showing the physical effects of what his daughter had done to him. His voice was weak but clear as he addressed the court. He said that standing there was one of the hardest things he'd ever done, that looking at his daughter and knowing she'd tried to murder him and his wife had broken something fundamental in his understanding of the world. He talked about the physical pain, the months of recovery still ahead, the permanent damage to his organs that would shorten his life. But he said the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of being hunted by your own child. He said he'd spent 14 years loving Ava, protecting her, trying to give her a good life. And she'd repaid that love by researching how to kill him slowly enough that no one would notice. Daniel's voice cracked as he talked about Eli, about a 9-year-old who'd been forced to choose between loyalty to his sister and saving his parents' lives. He said Eli cried himself to sleep most nights, plagued by guilt for telling the truth and nightmares about what might have happened if he hadn't. He said their family home felt haunted now, that they couldn't eat meals without remembering that poison had been in their food, couldn't trust that the life they'd built was safe anymore. He looked directly at Ava and said he wanted to believe she could change, that somewhere inside her was the capacity for remorse and growth. But he'd seen nothing in her eyes throughout this entire ordeal except cold calculation. He said whatever sentence the court imposed, he hoped it would be long enough for Ava to understand the enormity of what she'd done. Then he sat down heavily, exhausted by the effort of standing and speaking. Melissa had written her statement but couldn't read it aloud, her voice failing before she could begin. Wallace read it for her, and the words carried the weight of a mother's shattered heart. Melissa wrote that she'd given birth to Ava 14 years ago, had held her as an infant, and dreamed of who she might become. She'd never imagined that the baby she'd loved would grow into someone who could watch her suffer without feeling anything. She wrote about the specific cruelty of being poisoned by your own child, of eating food prepared by someone who was supposed to love you and realizing later that every bite had been designed to kill you. She wrote that she'd forgiven Ava 1,000 times in her mind for smaller things over the years, but this betrayal was beyond her capacity to forgive. She wrote that she hoped someday Ava would develop a conscience and would be haunted by what she'd done. And she ended by saying that whatever happened next, she and Daniel would focus on healing and helping Eli recover from trauma no child should ever experience. Judge Thornton thanked them for their statements and asked if the defendant wished to address the court. Chen leaned over and whispered urgently to Ava, probably advising her to apologize, to show remorse, to give the judge something that might inspire leniency. Ava stood slowly, and for a moment the courtroom held its breath, wondering if she would finally break, finally show the humanity everyone had been searching for. She looked at the judge and spoke in a clear, steady voice. She said she understood that people were upset, that the evidence looked bad, that her parents had gotten sick and everyone blamed her. But she said she wanted the court to know that she was smart, that she had her whole life ahead of her, that sending her to prison would be a waste of potential. She said she could do great things if given the chance, that she could contribute to society in important ways. She never said she was sorry. She never acknowledged her parents' pain. She made it about herself, about her intelligence and her future, as if those things mattered more than the people she'd tried to murder. The courtroom reacted with audible shock. Several people gasped. A juror who'd stayed to watch sentencing shook her head in disbelief. Melissa let out a sound that was half sob, half bitter laugh, the final confirmation that her daughter truly felt nothing. Judge Thornton's face remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes that might have been anger or profound sadness. She asked Ava if she had anything else to say, giving her one more chance to show remorse. Ava shook her head and said no, that was all. Chen looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, clearly mortified by his client's complete failure to help herself. Ava sat back down, looking satisfied with her statement, apparently believing she'd made a compelling case for leniency. She genuinely didn't understand that she'd just sealed her fate. Judge Thornton took a long moment before speaking, her hands folded on the bench in front of her. When she finally addressed the court, her voice carried the weight of 23 years of judicial experience and the burden of this particular decision. She said she'd presided over many difficult cases, but few had disturbed her as much as this one. She said the evidence showed a level of premeditation and calculation that was chilling regardless of the perpetrator's age. She said Ava Lambert had spent months researching, planning, and executing an attempt to murder both her parents, watching them suffer with clinical detachment, documenting their pain like a science experiment. She said the defendant had shown no remorse throughout the trial, no empathy for her victims, no understanding of the fundamental wrong she'd committed. And her statement just now had confirmed that she remained more concerned with her own future than with the devastation she'd caused. The judge acknowledged Ava's age, but said that age could not erase intent or excuse such calculated cruelty. She cited cases where juveniles had been held accountable for serious crimes while still receiving considerations appropriate to their developmental stage. She said the court had to balance multiple interests: justice for the victims, protection of society, and some possibility of rehabilitation for the defendant. She noted that the psychological evaluation suggested Ava's capacity for change was limited by her fundamental lack of empathy, but that young people could sometimes develop traits that seemed absent in adolescence. With all of this in mind, Judge Thornton announced her sentence. Ava Lambert would be committed to a secure juvenile facility until the age of 18. At 18, she would be transferred to adult corrections to serve the remainder of her sentence. The total term would be 40 years, with the possibility of parole after serving 25. The sentence landed like thunder. 40 years meant Ava would be 54 years old before she could even hope for release. She would spend her entire youth, her entire young adulthood, her entire middle age behind bars. The courtroom erupted in whispered reactions. Chen slumped in his chair, knowing he'd appeal, but also knowing the sentence was within legal guidelines. Wallace nodded once, satisfied that justice had been served, and Ava's face went through a transformation that everyone present would remember. First came shock, her eyes going wide as she processed the numbers. Then came panic as the reality sank in, and finally came rage, pure and undiluted, as she realized that her age hadn't protected her, that her intelligence hadn't saved her, that she would lose everything she'd taken for granted. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor, and shouted at the judge that it wasn't fair, that she was just a kid, that they couldn't do this to her. Judge Thornton remained calm, instructing the bailiff to maintain order. Ava continued shouting as they tried to escort her out, her composure completely shattered, her mask finally torn away to reveal the rage underneath. She screamed that everyone would regret this, that she didn't deserve this, that her parents should have just left her alone. Chen tried to quiet her, but she pushed him away. As the bailiff physically guided her toward the door, Ava looked back at her parents one final time. Daniel and Melissa stared back at their daughter, both of them crying, both of them looking relieved and heartbroken at once. And in that moment, Ava finally spoke 3 words she should have said months ago. But they weren't, "I'm sorry." They were, "It should have worked." She was still talking about the poisoning, still focused on the failure of her plan rather than the horror of her actions. Those words would be the last thing her parents heard from her before she disappeared through the courtroom doors, still shouting, still angry, still unable to comprehend that she'd brought this entirely upon herself. Justice had found her, just as it always does. And now she would spend the next 40 years learning what the rest of the world already knew, that some choices destroy you, that evil has consequences, and that a person who can plan murder at 14 will spend the rest of her life paying for that choice. The Lambert family left the courthouse through a side entrance, shielding themselves from the cameras and reporters who'd turned their private tragedy into a national story. Daniel's wheelchair bumped over the threshold as Melissa guided him toward their car, both of them moving like people who'd aged decades in a matter of months. They didn't speak to the press, they didn't release statements or give interviews. They simply wanted to go home and begin the long, painful process of rebuilding a life that had been shattered by someone who should have been their greatest joy. The physical recovery would take years, doctors had warned them. Daniel's kidneys showed permanent damage that might eventually require dialysis. Melissa's liver function had improved but would never be completely normal. But the emotional wounds ran deeper than any toxin could reach, and those would never fully heal. Eli came home from his grandmother's house that afternoon, his small suitcase packed with clothes and the stuffed animals that had comforted him through the worst months of his young life. He ran to his parents when he saw them, hugging them both with a desperation that made all three of them cry. He asked if Ava was coming home. Daniel knelt down, wincing at the pain in his weakened body, and explained gently that no, Ava would be gone for a very long time. She'd made choices that hurt people, and now she had to face the consequences of those choices. Eli asked if it was his fault for telling the truth. Melissa pulled him close and said no, that telling the truth had saved their lives, that he was the bravest person she'd ever known. She said he'd done exactly what he should have done, and nothing that happened was his responsibility. But the guilt in his eyes didn't fade completely. He was 9 years old and would spend the rest of his childhood processing the fact that his words had sent his sister to prison. The therapy started immediately. Eli saw a child psychologist twice a week, working through nightmares where his sister came home angry, processing the complex emotions of loving someone who'd tried to destroy his family. He drew pictures in therapy that his parents never saw, images of a dark figure standing over beds at night, of bottles with skull and crossbones symbols, of a little boy hiding under covers. His therapist said he was making progress, but progress was slow and non-linear. Some days Eli seemed fine, laughing at cartoons and playing with his friends like nothing had happened. Other days he'd refuse to eat anything he hadn't watched someone prepare, paranoid that food might be dangerous. His parents were patient with him, understanding that trauma didn't heal on a schedule. They assured him constantly that he was safe, that no one would hurt him, that the bad thing was over. Slowly, carefully, he started to believe them. Daniel and Melissa attended their own therapy sessions, both individual and couples counseling. They worked through the impossible task of grieving a child who was still alive but lost to them forever. Melissa struggled with guilt, wondering if there'd been signs she'd missed, moments when intervention might have changed the outcome. Her therapist reminded her repeatedly that psychopathy wasn't caused by bad parenting, that some people were simply born without the capacity for empathy, that she'd done nothing wrong. But the mother in her couldn't fully accept that explanation. She'd carried Ava for 9 months, had felt her kick and move, had imagined a future filled with school plays and graduation ceremonies and eventually grandchildren. That future was gone now, replaced by the reality of a daughter in prison for attempting to murder her. The grief was profound and complicated, mourning someone who was still breathing but would never be part of their lives again. The community struggled to process what had happened in their quiet suburb where nothing bad was supposed to occur. Parents held their children tighter and watched them more carefully, suddenly aware that intelligence and academic success didn't guarantee goodness. The Lambert case became a cautionary tale discussed in hushed tones at PTA meetings and neighborhood gatherings. How do you spot a child capable of such calculated violence? What warning signs had everyone missed? The questions haunted people because the answers were unsettling. Ava had been quiet, smart, emotionally distant, but none of those things predicted murder. Most teenagers with those traits grew up to be perfectly normal adults. The terrifying truth was that sometimes evil looked ordinary until it acted, and by then, it was almost too late. The school district implemented new protocols, training staff to watch for concerning behavior and take it more seriously. The English teacher who'd read Ava's story about poisoning and dismissed it as creative fiction now advocated loudly for mandatory reporting of violent content in student work. The librarian who'd seen Ava nervously using computers wished she'd asked more questions. Everyone who'd intersected with Ava's life before her arrest examined their memories, searching for the moment they might have intervened and wondering if intervention would have made any difference at all. The consensus among experts was probably not. Ava's lack of empathy appeared to be fundamental rather than situational, a personality structure that therapy and support couldn't easily change. Some people, the uncomfortable truth suggested, were simply wired differently from birth. Jennifer Wallace, the prosecutor who'd secured the conviction, gave one interview after the sentencing. She said that in 20 years of putting away criminals, Ava Lambert's case had disturbed her more than most adult offenders she'd prosecuted. The calculated nature of the crime, the complete absence of remorse, the way Ava had watched her parents suffer like they were laboratory specimens rather than human beings, all of it pointed to someone fundamentally disconnected from normal human emotion. Wallace said the hardest part was knowing that Ava was 14, that somewhere in the justice system's response they had to leave room for the possibility of change, even when change seemed unlikely. She said the 40-year sentence reflected that balance, giving Ava time to develop empathy if she was capable of it, while ensuring that society remained protected from someone who'd proven capable of such cruelty. The appeals began immediately, as everyone expected. Chen filed motion after motion arguing that the sentence was excessive for a juvenile, that trying Ava as an adult had been inappropriate, that her due process rights had been violated in various ways. Each appeal was reviewed carefully and ultimately denied. The evidence was too strong, the legal procedures too correct, the sentence too well within established guidelines. Years passed with Ava moving through the juvenile detention system, and reports from staff painted a concerning picture. She was a model inmate behaviorally, following rules and causing no trouble. But she formed no genuine connections with other residents or staff. She participated in required therapy sessions, but showed no real engagement or growth. Counselors noted that she'd learned to say the right things, to perform remorse and insight, but the performance felt hollow. The girl behind the words remained as empty as ever. Daniel Lambert framed something in their living room that surprised visitors who saw it. It was a photo of Eli from the day he testified, standing outside the courthouse looking small and scared but determined. Underneath it, Daniel had written, "The bravest person I know." He told people who asked that Eli had saved their lives twice, first by telling the truth and then by giving them a reason to keep fighting through recovery. Without their youngest child's courage and love, Daniel said, the despair might have consumed them. But Eli needed them, and so they kept going. They sold the house where the poisoning had occurred, unable to live in a space that held so many terrible memories. They moved to a new neighborhood, started fresh, tried to build a life defined by more than trauma. It was hard work. Some days felt impossible, but slowly, painfully, they began to heal. Years later, a journalist asked Melissa if she ever thought about Ava, if she wondered how her daughter was doing in detention. Melissa was quiet for a long moment before answering. She said she thought about Ava every day, about the baby she'd been and the person she'd become, about the fundamental mystery of how someone could be raised with love and still turn out incapable of feeling it. She said she'd tried to visit once, 2 years after the sentencing, hoping that time might have changed something. But sitting across from Ava in the visiting room, looking into those same flat eyes, Melissa realized that nothing had changed at all. Ava had asked when she might get out early for good behavior. She'd complained about the food and the rules. She'd never asked how her parents were doing or whether Eli was okay. Melissa left that visit and never went back. She said she had to accept that the daughter she'd wanted didn't exist and never had. The person who wore Ava's face was someone else entirely, someone she couldn't reach or save or love in any meaningful way. The prosecutor's words from that one interview echoed through discussions of the case for years afterward. Evil can wear a school uniform. It became a shorthand for the uncomfortable reality that age didn't guarantee innocence, that young people could make choices as calculating and cruel as any adult. The Ava Lambert case was studied in law schools and psychology programs, analyzed in books and documentaries, held up as an example of juvenile psychopathy, and the criminal justice system struggled to address it appropriately. But for the Lambert family, it wasn't a case study or a cautionary tale. It was their life, the nightmare they'd survived, and the scars they'd carry forever. And in the end, what sustained them wasn't the verdict or the sentence or the public vindication. What sustained them was each other, the bonds that Ava had tried to poison but couldn't quite destroy. The final echo came from Eli, years later when he was older and better able to understand what had happened. A therapist asked him what he'd learned from everything his family had been through. He thought carefully before answering, choosing his words with the wisdom of someone who'd faced darkness early and survived it. He said he'd learned that loving someone didn't mean trusting them blindly, that sometimes the people closest to you could hurt you the most, and that telling the truth was hard but necessary even when it felt like betrayal. He said he'd learned that his parents were stronger than he'd ever imagined, that justice sometimes worked the way it should, and that families could survive almost anything if they held on to each other. And then he said something that made his therapist write it down to remember. He said, "I learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and telling the truth anyway." That truth, spoken by a child who'd saved his parents' lives, was perhaps the most important lesson of all. Justice had found Ava Lambert just as it always does. But more than that, courage had saved the people she'd tried to destroy. And in the end, that courage meant more than any verdict ever could.